Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. In this video, I will undertake a comparison of Emanuel Swedenborg's, his dates are 1688 to 1772, and his visionary representation of the subjectivity of Baroque modernity with the visionary writings of Aleister Crowley, 1875 to 1947, within his own context of high modernity. Swedenborg's Heaven and Its Wonders in Hell and Crowley's The Book of the Law, transcribed from an angelic conversation, and his The Vision and the Voice will serve as primary examples of their respective authors' spiritual systems. An important theological difference will emerge between the two figures. Swedenborg's visions are unilateral in their scale of value. Everything in the universe is normatively turned in spiritual orientation towards the Son of Heaven, symbolizing the hermeneutical centrality of the monotheistic God in his theology. However, in Crowley's visions of heavenly realms, the further development of the cultural relations of production and modernity has led to the breakdown of the unilateral, universal scale of values of liberal humanism. Therefore, in Crowley's visions, the sun symbolizes the divine status of the particular human self qua its individuality, which is not received or vested in a reality ultimately separate or external to the self's existence. Further, one's own sun is one of many stars which together comprise the symbolic star field of the company of heaven, so called in the Book of the Law, chapter 1, verse 2. The theological implications of this difference will be interpreted in relationship to the larger narrative of the historical context of the author's experiences of modernization. These three texts by two authors share significant similarities, beyond their obvious connection as narratives of angelic visions with symbolic, theological, and spiritual contents. All three texts share an apocalyptic theme and can be considered revelatory prophecies whose writing is itself an apocalyptic event. In his preface to Heaven and Hell, Swedenborg comments on the Gospel of Matthew's description of the Last Judgment. Quote, "When people understand these words according to their literal meaning, they can only believe that all these things are going to happen just as this meaning describes them, at that end of time called the Last Judgment. The whole visible world is going to be destroyed, and that afterwards a new heaven and a new earth will come into being. However, people who believe such things are not aware of the hidden depths that lie within the details of the word. There is, in fact, spiritual meaning in these details, for they intend not only the outward and earthly events that we find on the literal level, but spiritual and heavenly events as well." Unquote. Swedenborg's visionary revelations are themselves the apocalypse in which God and the spiritual world are revealed. Swedenborg writes that these words in Matthew, quote, "mean that at the end of the church, when there is no longer any love and therefore no longer any faith, the Lord will open the word by disclosing its deeper meaning and will reveal the heavenly contents hidden within it. The particular contents to be disclosed in the pages that follow have to do with heaven and hell and with our own life after death. The reason this kind of direct revelation is taking place today is that this is what the coming of the Lord means." Unquote. Likewise, in terms of Crowley's corpus, the reception of the Book of the Law by way of dictation from the angel Aiwass on April 8, 9, and 10 of 1904 signaled the occult initiation of the liberative eon of Horus, of whom Crowley was magus and prophet, and heralded the destruction by fire of the slave religions of the preceding Christian era. The Vision and the Voice is the transcript of a series of astral projections in the 30 ethers, or ascending spiritual planes of the Enochian system of magic. Originally created by the Elizabethan magicians John Dee and Edward Kelly, Enochian magic was elaborated and taught in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, whose magical system Crowley in turn elaborated. Mostly written during a magical retirement in the deserts of Algeria in 1909, these 30 visions extend the message and themes of the Book of the Law. Angels appear, uttering esoteric speeches amid complex symbolic tableaus where the symbolism and theology of the old eon of Christianity are subverted and supplanted by the Thelemic mythology of the new eon. I would propose that the theme of apocalypse in both prophets corresponds to the larger historical context of the revolution of the progressive development of modern life, whereby the former traditional cultural life world of medieval life is experienced as passing away. Therefore, an examination of these writers' apocalyptic visionary works will provide insight into their theological relationship to modernization, as this will appear reflected in the context of their writings. This historical trace within their texts will furthermore serve as an additional modality to the symbolic, esoteric exegesis of their theologies as well. What do I mean by modern in relationship to the esoteric visionary work of Swedenborg and Crowley? Jacob Needleman, reflecting on the significance of modern esoteric spiritualities, writes that, quote, a general feature of these teachings that is intensely relevant to the modern crisis is their psychological thrust. The accelerating breakdown of social and political ideologies has rendered seemingly unattainable the ideal of meaningful human community in an ever-globalizing world. More and more, the modern man or woman has been driven to the individual self as the locus of healing and meaning. We live in a psychological era, unquote. This theme of individuality appears in both Swedenborg and Crowley. It is present within Swedenborg's liberal Enlightenment ethos. In Crowley, it lies in a further theological privileging of individuality in his theme that all human beings are divine beings. Both figures lived in different periods of modernization, which can be designated Baroque and Modernist, or High Modernist. In his introduction to the New Century edition of Heaven and Hell, Bernard Long writes, quote, known as the Age of the Baroque, the 17th and 18th centuries boasted a rich artistic, literary, religious, and political culture, of which the terms Enlightenment, that is, Baroque rationalism, and classical music can capture no more than small fragments, unquote. As for modernism, for the purposes of this paper, I will roughly define it as the period from the end of the 19th century to the cultural onset of the 1960s. Swedenborg's Baroque Enlightenment liberal ethos is reflected in his theology. He writes, it is not so hard to lead a heaven-bound life as people think it is, so he declares. Gone is the ascetic Christianity of medieval feudalism, its narrative of salvation focused on a monastic and saintly elite. Instead, the middle or upper class citizen living in civil society is at the center of theological attention. In other words, the emancipated bourgeoisie of Enlightenment liberalism is the subject of Swedenborg's theology. He writes, if we would accept heaven's life, we need by all means to live in the world and to participate in its duties and affairs, unquote. As for Aleister Crowley, he can be recognized amidst the gallery of modernist intellectuals. Crowley biographer Lawrence Sutin writes, quote, Crowley was a master modernist whose fierce impatience with restrictions on form and thought linked him to fellow iconoclasts of his era such as D.H. Lawrence, Wyndham Lewis, and Ezra Pound, unquote. At first reading, Crowley might seem an obvious candidate for the avant-garde right, classed with the other modernists just mentioned. However, a closer look dispels the simplicity of an unambiguous right-wing typing of Crowley, as the lineaments of an authentic class rebel emerge. How should Crowley's radical rebellion against the bourgeois societal values of his era be understood? Answers to this question lie in a closer look at Crowley's class consciousness, based upon his historical context. His family's ownership of a brewery locates Crowley's initial class coordinates within the bourgeoisie. Lawrence Sutin notes, quote, Crowley was heir to the luxurious life the British Empire could offer to its fortunate upper class, unquote. Crowley's self-consciousness originates within the bourgeois elitism of the gentry, yet he is cut off from the social recognition of this context because of his queer identity, thereby placing himself in rebellion against those very values. This liminal quality of Crowley's social and existential situation allows him to exceed certain boundaries in his otherwise bourgeois framework that give him significant relevance for a contemporary radical appropriation of his work. It is crucial to understand Crowley's context as that of an oppressed person of homosexual, specifically bisexual, identity. This factor both constructs and constricts his identity. Queerness is no more peripheral to Crowley than being Irish was to James Joyce. Crowley's queer marginality is useful for a contemporary interpretation of Thelema, as it facilitates a contextual bracketing of his occult fetishizing of royalist gallantry, a symbolism he shares in common with the culture of heroic romanticism. Thus bracketed as contextual detail instead of essential truth, other more liberative aspects of Crowley's thought come into relief and become available for contemporary appropriation. Further clarity regarding the ideological subtleties of Swedenborg and Crowley's theologies can be gained through examination of sun symbolism, which plays a central role in both figures' visionary systems. Swedenborg writes, quote, "In the spiritual world, divine love and wisdom look like a sun. I have in fact seen it, and it seemed about the same size as the sun of this physical world. It had a similar fiery look, but was more reddish. I was given to understand that the whole angelic heaven lies beneath this sun. That sun is not the Lord himself, though it is from the Lord. What looks like the sun in the spiritual world is the emanating divine love and wisdom." Unquote. There is an incarnational impulse at work here in Swedenborg's thinking. If Jesus as the Lord is God, then God is principally a person, not a sun. Therefore, the sun symbolizes the unilateral value of God, but refers to God as the divine or universal human. Quote, "Take care not to think that the spiritual world sun is actually God. The real God is a person. The first emanation from his love and wisdom is something fiery and spiritual that looks like a sun to angels. When the Lord makes himself visible to angels in person, then he does so in human form, sometimes within the sun, sometimes outside it." Unquote. Therefore, for Swedenborg, although the sun does not look like a person, in his symbolism the sun corresponds to the divine human person. The divine human is the God's human body. It is the form of heaven and the human angels who compose heaven, like cells in the organism of God's body. Even the material human body in the physical world relates to the divine human body. Swedenborg writes, "It is recognized that the human body is held together in its form from the outside by some active or living force. Otherwise, it would instantly collapse. Anything that is not connected to something prior and through prior things to a first does perish instantly. The divine human, or the inflow therefrom, is that prior thing through which the human being in all particulars is connected with the first, that is, with the Lord." Unquote. The anthropomorphic heaven of Swedenborg's visions is like a fractal. The archetypal bodily form of God and humans alike replicates and folds in on itself at every level. Quote, "Angels are in the Lord, and the Lord is in them. The Lord is not only in heaven, but actually is heaven itself." Unquote. It begins to be difficult to clearly demarcate where humanness and divinity diverge into real distinction, because in Swedenborg's thinking they share the same form. In some sense, divinity and humanity are the same for Swedenborg. Their ultimate unity expressed in the symbol of the angelic body, common to God and all souls. Regardless, it is clear the modern theme of human individuality or personhood is highly significant for Swedenborg. The sun symbolizes the divine body of the human person. The sun in heaven establishes a single unified orientation for heaven and its angels. Swedenborg writes, quote, "As for the sun that is the source of angels' warmth and light, they see it at about a 45-degree angle above the lands where they live at a middle elevation. It also seems to be about as far from angels as this world's sun is from us. They see the sun at that height and distance constantly. It does not move." Unquote. The reason the sun remains at this position, quote, "is that it enables angels to turn their faces towards the Lord constantly and see him with their eyes. For angels, the east, and therefore the Lord, is in front of them no matter which way they turn their bodies, which is a unique feature of their world. Angels turning toward the Lord is like this. No matter which way they turn their bodies, they are looking at the Lord as the sun in front of themselves. Angels can turn this way and that and can thus see the various things that surround them. But still the Lord as the sun seems to be constantly in front of them. I too have been allowed to see the Lord as the sun like this. I have been seeing him in front of me for a number of years. Whatever direction I turned to, I saw him like this." Unquote. The spiritual symbolism, and therefore the significance of this situation for Swedenborg, is that God as the Sun establishes a single unilateral scale of value for human beings, such that we all have a normative orientation for our living. Ideologically, this signifies the universality of Swedenborg's theology of bourgeois liberalism under the post-apocalyptic conditions of the Enlightenment. Quote, all these statements about angels and the way they face the Lord as the Sun should also be understood as applying to us spiritually, Swedenborg writes, since we are spirits as to our minds, and angels if we are engaged in love and wisdom. Since angels do constantly face the sunrise, the Lord, we say of people who are engaged in love and wisdom from the Lord that they see God, that they look to God, and that they have God before their eyes, meaning that they are living like angels, unquote. The symbolism of the sun also occupies a prominent place in Aleister Crowley's works. The very name of the occult order from which his initial magical training derived, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, alludes to the solar symbolism of its theurgic system. For the ceremonial magicians of the Golden Dawn, the rising of the sun in the east symbolized the light of Gnosis, whose recipients were open to visionary contact with higher angelic planes of existence. For Crowley, the sun signifies the divinity of human existence. However, each sun is also a star amidst the galaxies of heaven, where each other star is also recognized as divine. According to the Book of the Law, every man and every woman is a star. In his commentary to this text, Crowley says that, quote, its main statement is that each human being is an element of the cosmos, self-determined and supreme, co-equal with all other gods. Therefore, you have an infinite number of gods, individual and equal, though diverse. Every man and every woman is not only a part of God, but the ultimate God. The old definition of God takes new meaning for us. Each one of us is the one God, unquote. The Vision and the Voice is a work of rich and complex symbolic content. For the purposes of this video, the opening scenery of the ultimate vision of the sequence holds significant importance, as it is a representation of heaven as the cosmic star field. Quote, the veil of the ether is like the veil of night, dark azure, full of countless stars. Because the veil is infinite, at first one seeth not the winged globe of the sun that burneth in the center thereof. Profound peace filleth me. Beyond ecstasy, beyond thought, beyond being itself, iata. This word means I am, but in a sense entirely beyond being. Yes, there is peace. There is no tendency of any sort, much less any observation or feeling or impression. There is only a faint consciousness, like the scent of jasmine. The body of the seer is rested in a waking sleep that is deeper than sleep, and his mind is still. He seems like a well in the desert, shaded by windless palms, and it is night. Because the night is the whole night of space, and not the partial night of earth, there is no thought of dawn. For the light of the sun maketh illusion, blinding man's eyes to the glory of the stars, and unless he be in the shadow of the earth, he cannot see the stars. So unless he be hidden from the light of life, he cannot behold Nuit. Here then do I abide in unalterable midnight, utterly at peace. Unquote. The symbol of the star field of selves composing the body of the Egyptian sky goddess Nuit constitutes a basic orientating interpretive horizon of the Thelemic spirituality. The star field symbol appears in multiple contexts within the Thelemic corpus, most especially in the Book of the Law. Quote, the unveiling of the company of heaven, every man and every woman is a star, chapter 1, verses 2 through 3. These star selves shine from the heat sparked from the mystical marriage of the dialectical mediation of Nuit and Hadit. Quote, infinite space is called the goddess Nuit, Crowley writes, while the infinitely small and atomic yet omnipresent point is called Hadit. Our central truth beyond other philosophies is that these two infinities cannot exist apart, unquote. Just as Nuit's body is composed of the atomic structure of Hadit, inseparable from her, so Hadit in itself is a vanishing point. As Hadit continually mediates itself with Nuit in their mystical marriage, symbolized by Ra-Hor-Khuit, Horus's sun god, then emerges as a star. The symbol of Ra-Hor-Khuit stands for a relational individuality under a figure of the dialectical synthesis of unit and continuum, of content and context, of private subjectivity and public society. The isolated monadic individual of bourgeois ideology is dispelled and replaced by a social vision of the star field of selves as liberated community. Various theological implications follow from the above. The divine status of human beings, realized through magical gnosis, implies the twin positive commandments of the law of Thelema: do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and love is the law, love under will. Crowley writes, by liberty is the power to direct your course according to your will. For the extent of the universe is without bounds, and ye are free to make your pleasure as ye will, seeing that the diversity of being is infinite also. Unquote. Interestingly, I find this position has a degree of hermeneutical fit when correlated with the philosophy of Ludwig Feuerbach, especially in his 1841 work, The Essence of Christianity, Das Wesen des Christentums. Feuerbach writes, man, this is the mystery of religion, projects his being into objectivity, and then again makes himself an object to this projected image of himself, thus converted into a subject. There is no distinction between the predicates of the divine and human nature, and consequently no distinction between the divine and human subject. Unquote. I would rephrase this in terms of a Thelemic motto, Deus est homo, there is no God but man. This interpretive move of introducing an inversion of my text's apparent meaning by way of Feuerbach moves a little beyond Crowley's own understanding of his thought. Swedenborg and Crowley understand the divine human or star self as spiritually transcending natural physical existence, whereas Feuerbach and my own methodological horizon are more thoroughly naturalized. A significant advantage of this methodological maneuver is that it facilitates an ideological interpretation of both Swedenborg and Crowley's anthropomorphism against the background of modernization, spanning the Baroque and modernist periods that precede our own era of so-called postmodernity. The sun or star and its symbolic representation in their visions correspond to the existential experience of the modern bourgeois subject. With this interpretive insight, our understanding of the historical experience of the subject is enriched, and we gain clues towards the interpretation of our contemporary experience of the modern. As described by philosophers such as Guy Debord, the present is a time when the spectacular quality of culture reaches new levels of intensity, such that the world we live in on a day-to-day basis becomes a kind of virtual reality. What can we learn from the visionaries of earlier modernities that can help us understand our present hallucinations? In light of Thelemic theology's own potential, this approach opens a rich hermeneutical horizon for the project of critically discerning a practice and theory of liberation within the context of the Thelemic community. According to Gustavo Gutierrez, in liberation, humanity is seen as assuming conscious responsibility for its own destiny, unquote, a goal consonant with the law of Thelema. In the symbolism of the Book of the Law, once again, every man and every woman is a star set among the company of heaven of the star field of the body of Nuit, the Egyptian goddess of the night sky. Crowley writes, each star is connected directly with every other star, and the space being without limit, Ein Sof, the body of Nuit, any one star is as much the center as any other. Each man instinctively feels that he is the center of the cosmos. The yokel is no more petty than the king, nor the earth than the sun. Each simple elemental self is supreme, very God of very God, unquote. The vision of the star field implies an egalitarian space of mutual liberation as the appropriate political expression of the law of Thelema. How far this utopian horizon of Thelemic praxis has been realized or hindered within the community should be discerned and diagnosed by Thelemic theology of liberation. So far with Crowley. What possibilities emerge for Swedenborg's theology? The star field, as I am interpreting its allegory, disrupts the unilateral horizon of value in Swedenborg's heaven. There is not one sun in heaven, but many stars in the heavens. Each star becomes a center of light, a bearer and producer of value. As for Swedenborg's visionary narratives, drawn from things heard and seen, subtitle of Heaven and Hell, once the symbolism of the sun is broadened to include alternative interpretations, many useful features of Swedenborg's thought become apparent. When problems emerge, it is only necessary to enter into the imaginative spirit of the visions to find creative solutions. When William Blake journeys in imaginative vision to heaven and hell in his poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he does not see quite as Swedenborg sees, although there are congruencies. Rather, Blake uses Swedenborg as a jumping off point, a launching pad for his own vision's flight. For example, Swedenborg's concept of the divine human itself can be broadened to include all other forms of life. Crowley makes the following comment in his Notes for an Astral Atlas. Quote, microcosms and elementals. Maybe an elemental, example a dog, has a cosmic conception in which he is a microcosm and man incomplete. No means of deciding same, unquote. So perhaps within Swedenborg's spiritual world, there is a heaven where dogs go after death, and it is arranged in canine form, the various kennels and packs corresponding to the relevant anatomy. Swedenborg missed seeing this heaven because his difference in spiritual state as a human is so different from that of dogs. Therefore, he erroneously concluded that animals die fully at physical death and do not participate in the afterlife. Heaven, it turns out, is different for everyone. Swedenborg assures us of this when he writes, quote, almost all the people who arrive in the other life think that hell is the same for everyone and that heaven is the same for everyone, when in fact there are infinite variations and differences in each. Hell is never the same for any two people, nor is heaven. When I even thought about two identical or equal beings, the angels were aghast. They said that every unity is formed by a harmonious agreement of many constituents, and that the nature of the unity depends on the nature of the agreement. This is how every community of heaven forms a unity, and how all the communities form a single heaven, which is accomplished solely by the Lord by means of love. Unquote. This organic conception that informs Swedenborg's visions, where the whole is based on the parts and the parts upon the whole, is an especially evocative theme. According to Martin Lamb, unquote, under the influence of Aristotle, Plotinus, Leibniz, and also of modern science, the mechanistic conception of nature gives way to clearly organic one. Nature is a system of ends which mutually condition each other. It is a living organism whose development is best explained by the analogies offered by the human anatomy. This organic conception of nature is translated by his, Swedenborg's, scientific mind, by his systematic application of the doctrine according to which all that exists in the macrocosm is reflected in the microcosm. Not only humanity, but even the most minute particle of the universe constitutes a world in miniature, presenting the same organic structure and subject to the same laws as the macrocosm. For Swedenborg, the theory of series and degrees serves above all to illustrate the organic interconnectedness of everything in nature, unquote. Nature is an organism whose archetype is ultimately expressed by the divine human form of heaven. Swedenborg writes, it is hard to explain this in such a way that it can be grasped without resorting to expressions usually found in academic circles and using them to explain how a perfect whole is formed from a variety of elements. Every perfect whole arises from a variety of elements, for a whole that is not composed of a variety of elements is not really anything. It has no form and therefore no quality. However, when a whole does arise from a variety of elements, the elements are in a perfected form in which each associates with the next in a series like a sympathetic friend, then it has a perfect quality. Heaven is then a single whole composed of a variety of elements arranged in the most perfect form, for of all forms the form of heaven is the most perfect. Unquote. Swedenborg's organic thinking contributes to the evolution of natural science and anticipates later scientific developments in ecology, yet it is precisely the freedom he allows himself to creatively speculate in the elaborations of his visionary imagination that Swedenborg is able to articulate these insights. Like Albert Einstein's imaginative thought experiments that allowed him to formulate the theory of relativity, Swedenborg's visions code very real scientific insights. Likewise, the star field is not a representation of an ideal metaphysical state of affairs, but of a material reality of the history of the new eon it prophesies and stands as a metaphor for. It is a visionary representation of the radical Enlightenment itself, of the potential culture of the modern life world. The French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser reminds us that ideology has a material existence. That is to say, that the Thelemic subject's ideas of a new eon are, as Althusser says, material actions inserted into material practices, governed by material rituals, which are themselves defined by the material ideological apparatus from which derive the ideas of that subject. Unquote. In other words, the new eon is best hermeneutically grasped as materially, which is to say, socially constructed culture, on which foundation it is represented as a spiritual archetype. For spirit, the Marxist knows, is the visionary image of society projected by and for the true gods of cosmic reality, human beings. Every man and every woman is a star. Western spiritualities such as Christianity and neo-paganism have a tendency to posit a transcendent supernatural world where their angels or gods exist, whether this is conceived as the transcosmic reality beyond the sphere of the fixed stars, as with traditional Christianity and the Hellenic pagans of antiquity, or more contemporary terms such as heaven or the astral plane. Since angels and gods are ultimately symbols of human existence, positing the being of these gods in a separate world generates an ideological gravity that tends to draw the location of value and meaning away from the immediate life world of human beings and posit it elsewhere. According to Feuerbach's argument, quote, to enrich God, man must become poor. That God may be all, man must be nothing. Unquote. In contrast, a naturalized methodology prevents the separation of value from this world by locating human creative praxis as the base for the projection of human practices into the superstructure of the ideological space of society and its visionary sublation. Such an interpretation of the visionary instantiates Hegel's recognition that the objectivity of spirit is society. Spirit, the substance of the angelic, is the I that is we and the we that is I. In his own visionary practice, Crowley has made progress in achieving the marriage of heaven and hell, prophesied by Blake, although there remains much work to be done. Crowley's texts enact a radical critique of bourgeois values, especially regarding sexuality, not unlike the voice of other critics of modernization, such as Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx. Yet Swedenborg's liberal humanist visions likewise critique his society in contextually radical ways that also revolve around the spiritual value of sexuality. Swedenborg's concept of conjugal love names the site of a radical rethinking of Christian theology and spirituality. He writes, there are marriages in the heavens just as there are on earth, unquote. Colleen McDaniel and Bernard Lang emphasize the radical content of conjugal love, writing that while Swedenborg's depictions of heavenly kingdoms, cities, and societies far exceed those of other writers, it is his portrayal of marriage and sex in heaven which completely separates his visions from those of his contemporaries, unquote. Swedenborg's radical challenge to conventional ideas of sexuality finds a parallel in Crowley's practice of sex magic. Both Swedenborg and Crowley are contextually transgressive, but in Crowley's case, this is magnified by a desire to ideologically startle his readers out of their comfort zone through the representation of perversion. Here, the Marquis de Sade and the French style of literary decadence, whose saint was Baudelaire, designate a lineage of writing that is foreign to Swedenborg's boundaries of propriety, but with which Crowley was at home, and whose output included several books of satirical pornography. One of them, The Scented Garden of Abdullah, the Satirist of Shiraz, concerns itself with the details of homoerotic mysticism in the guise of a fake Orientalist translation of Persian poetry. As argued above in connection with Feuerbach, the symbolism of the sun is explicitly a self-projection in Crowley, and implicitly the same in Swedenborg. However, Swedenborg inverts the real material relationship between signifier and signified, sun equals material person, by positing an ideal Platonic archetypal locus of symbolic signification. Therefore, if hell is defined as the inversion of heaven in the visionary allegory of his system, then perhaps heaven's values are really upside down and hell is oriented correctly. What are the values of hell that oppose heaven? Swedenborg tells us they are love of the world and love of self, contrasting with heaven's love of God and love of the neighbor. In other words, hell's dwellers are self centered rather than God centered. Yet, if the wisdom of hell, like Blake's Secrets of Hell, is that every man and every woman is a star, then the devils have a clearer understanding of what's going on in the spirit world than the angels, who erroneously believe they are worshiping an external being. Certainly, the devils have realized their Enlightenment autonomy and liberated individuality more deeply than the angels, who believe they must still obey an authority outside and transcending their own conscience. Devils, of course, can act freely in accord with their own moral will. This subversive interpretation of hell inverts its negative connotation in Swedenborg's own interpretation. However, it is possible to derive value from this negative moment of understanding hell as well. If, as Swedenborg describes, we are all born into natural evil and will all fall into hell unless we freely choose to actualize the divine influx of goodness available to us, then this situation is an implicit critique of the fallen contradictions of the bourgeois subject itself, cut off from its full possibility of social relationship because of the atomizing, isolating effects of the commodification of civil society under the conditions of mercantile modernization. That is to say, the atomization, isolation, and diversification of perspective in modern society are ideological symptoms of the relations of cultural production as their historical development continues. Swedenborg and Crowley occupy different line segments along the graph of this history, but they lie along the common sweep of a single curve. As post-Enlightenment writers, both Swedenborg and Crowley emphasize individuality in their works. However, the modern concept of individuality has limits. No self is in fact completely isolated in its individuality of perspective or capable of isolation. All possible modes of individuality are themselves social variations of an interrelated human community. Even Robinson Crusoe, the hero of Daniel Defoe's early modern novel, lands on his island from somewhere. In conclusion, I have made no attempt in this work to rank Crowley as more politically progressive or radical than Swedenborg, as naively tempting as this might seem at first glance. Crowley's libertine practices of sex, drugs, and sorcery contrast vividly with Swedenborg's bourgeois propriety and lifestyle of ascetic retirement, yet the first glance is misleading, because being radical is not a universal status with fixed attributes, but a matter of historical contextuality. Therefore, within their respective Baroque and High Modernist contexts, both Swedenborg and Crowley partake of a radically critical relationship to their religious context. Each pushes the envelope in their creative reimagining of religion. Swedenborg's accounts of sex in heaven are in their own way as taboo-breaking as Crowley's experiments in sex magic. However, in their differing orientations towards the normativity of the liberal bourgeois ethos, Swedenborg relatively pro, Crowley savagely con, this too must be viewed historically and contextually. For the development of the bourgeoisie as a class and its relationship towards the prevailing social relations of cultural production are very different in the periods of Baroque and High Modernity. In the Baroque era, the bourgeoisie are still emerging from the social relations of feudalism and play an active revolutionary role in the appropriation and transformation of medieval culture under the new conditions of Enlightenment society. Swedenborg carries out this role within the domain of the ideological production of theology, which he revolutionizes. In contrast, under the conditions of high modernity, the bourgeoisie have lost its revolutionary character and have become, like the decadent aristocracy of late feudalism, in its turn, decadent, quietist, and passive in relation to the cultural status quo. Bourgeois ideology often serves a conservative role, contested by avant-garde intellectuals such as Crowley and proletariat protesters alike. Within this context, Crowley takes up an antagonistic posture towards the prevailing social norms, which he also attempts to revolutionize. Today, this struggle continues.